Hi, everyone. My name is John Daly. I want to welcome you all to the first episode of the Reagan Caucus Podcast. I'm here with my co host, Thomas D. Howes, who is deeply involved with Reagan Caucus Action. How's it going today, Thomas?
Oh, it's going well. Thank you, John. Thank you for agreeing to be my co-host, or for doing this podcast with me.
Oh, absolutely. It's my pleasure. And what I think would be a really good idea, Thomas, just to start things off, if you could sort of let people know about yourself a little bit and let people know what Reagan Caucus Action is all about.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, my name's Tom House. My background's in philosophy, political philosophy, ethics. But about a year ago, and I do some lecturing at Princeton on a contract basis. And about a year ago, I started a PAC. What it started was I was writing an article about how I first started writing an article about how we need to reform primaries, right? And then what I found was that my thesis didn't really stand up. Like that, I thought that the primaries were necessarily these radicalizing things, the way that they're structured, that only the hardliners would show up. And it turns out it just really depends. It depends on who your primary electorate is. Sometimes they're a moderating force, sometimes they're a conservative force, a force for promoting things like constitutionalism, and other times they get filled with populists who want to tear everything down. It just depends on the primary electorate. So then my thesis switched to we need to build a faction, at least because I'm conservative. Say to my liberal friends, they should do this on the Democrat side. But I'm a conservative. We need to build a faction of conservatives, people who really believe in like Reaganite conservatism within GOP primaries. Now, that is not the mission of Reagan Caucus Action, which hosts this podcast. The Reagan Caucus Action, which hosts this podcast, is just starting. It's a 501c4, and it's more focused on the education side. We want to not just persuade people towards sort of American constitutionalism, the rule of law, all these great conservative values, but to come over, but actually also educate people that are already consider themselves conservatives or just other Americans on these ideals. So that's why I wanted to start a podcast. We also plan on doing regular articles. Once we get our website up in the next couple of weeks, we can start doing the daily articles. That will be the first. It's just the start of something we hope that will be big. Sort of a an approach towards education, so that we can improve the quality of the education within the electorate, of the general electorate.
Excellent, and it's a great mission. And for those unfamiliar with me, I'll just do a quick describe. I'm a conservative columnist. I write mostly for BernardGoldberg.com, former CBS News journalist. But people can also find my writing, through National Review and Pace Magazine and some other places. I'm also a thriller novelist. When I for my books, I go under the name John A. Daly, mainly to avoid confusion with the snappy dressing professional golfer that shares my name. But we're not here to talk about me, of course. And on the Reagan podcast, we'll be talking about Reaganite policy and statesmanship, civic education, and American constitutionalism. And as part of that mission, we'll be having on some smart guests to talk about a variety of issues, including the guest we have today. His name is Clifford Smith. He is a lawyer, investigator. He's a writer, and he's a former congressional staffer. And he recently went on a very enlightening trip to Ukraine, which he's going to tell us about. We hope you all find this discussion both interesting and educational. Cliff, thanks for joining us for this first episode of the Reagan Caucus Podcast. It's a pleasure, as always, to talk to you.
Great. Good to talk to you guys, too.
As I mentioned in the lead up, you recently went to Ukraine to see the situation there for yourself. The Russian invasion is now over 3 years old. It's a war-torn region that you visited, and I know there was a lot to digest. Can you start by telling everyone how this trip came together and what you saw once you got there?
Sure. Well, on top of my day job doing government affairs, I'm also a freelance writer, and I've been doing that. Depending on how you count, you could start back as early as 2013. I started doing it a lot in 2021. And I had cared about the Ukrainian cause for a very long time, too. I actually wrote my first column on behalf of the Ukrainian cause way back in 2014 when I criticized correctly, I might say, the Obama administration for doing far, far, far too little when Crimea was invaded. I mean, the full-scale invasion started under Biden, but the real war, in a lot of ways, did start with the invasion of Crimea. Anyway, I had written about it occasionally ever since, and this past summer, I was talking to an associate of mine, a guy I knew, and he had told me that a few businessmen in the DC area that were sort of on the outs with a lot of the different political establishments these days, as you guys might be able to sympathize with, were taking different people, different journalists and thinkers to Ukraine so they could see it for themselves. And I told them, oh, wow, well, I'd like to go. I'd written a bunch of, fair amount about Ukraine, although, I was not a Ukraine expert. I mostly did it from a domestic political angle, discussing sort of how it was affecting Republican and Democratic politics, things of that nature. But I recognized the Ukrainian issue, particularly after the full-scale invasion, for what it plainly is, in my view, and that is an attempt at a complete revision of the post-World War II and post-Cold War world orders. And that is one of the reasons why I consider myself a Reaganite, because I believed in that and wanted to preserve it. So, Ukraine, when it became an issue, instantly shot to the top of my list and of an issues I really cared about, because I knew it was the biggest attempt in my lifetime to overturn that. And so, yeah, I, sent them my stuff, said, hey, look, I'd really like to go. And a few months later, I went. It's pretty much that simple.
Excellent. Now you started, can you talk about getting there? I know it's a difficult trip, a very long trip, because not just, because of how far away it is, but because of all the security issues. I think people might find that interesting.
Sure. It's you can't fly into Ukraine as a civilian, right? It just can't be done. There are no airports open. They're too vulnerable to attack. And so you cannot get there the way you would get to Paris or Jakarta or any other city, you name it. What you have to do is you have to fly somewhere into Europe. In my case, I flew from DC to Frankfurt, from Frankfurt to Krakow, Poland. From Krakow, Poland, you take a train to the Polish-Ukrainian border, which takes about 2 hours, and then from the Ukrainian border, took another train, which is an overnight train from the Polish border to Kyiv. Which is what I can't remember, probably 8 or 10 hours. So it is quite a trip. I mean, you're basically looking at 2 full days at least just for the trip. That said, it was an enlightening trip. Even the trip itself, you can see some interesting things. I mean, I'd actually spent 2 months in Poland studying abroad when I was in law school many years ago. But Poland. I spent too much in Krakow, where I landed, actually. And Krakow has changed a lot since 2008, when I was last there. It's gotten much more modern. It was always a nice city, but it's gotten much more modern, much more wealthy, as Poland in total has. And that's an interesting part of the calculation, because Poland itself is sort of the first line of NATO's defense, and it's one of the most powerful militaries in Europe now. And it's going to continue to increase. So that was interesting. And then, you get into Ukraine, and, it doesn't look like the rest of Europe, to my way of thinking. The parts of Europe I'd been to, I mean, it's you hear it's the breadbasket of Europe, take that literally. I mean, it is very much like Nebraska, long fields, long, fertile grounds, a lot of farmland. If you've ever been to Nebraska, I have, it looks kind of like that. But the cities are very large. I get to Kyiv, and it was a massive city. And I admit I was not prepared, again, for how modern Kyiv was. Kyiv, being the capital and largest city, I've seen Soviet era movies, right? And movies set in Soviet era. And I'd, looked at pictures and history books, and even in more modern books, and, pictures of, outside of Red Square of Moscow, or, St. Petersburg, or what have you. And I guess I expected Ukraine to look sort of like what the rest of the former Soviet Union did. And it's absolutely true that it does in part look like that. I mean, there are old Soviet era buildings and old Soviet apartments that are kind of gray and dismal, and that's definitely part of the landscape. I'm not trying to say it's not. However, it's also parts of it are extremely modern. I mean, the amount of malls and restaurants and shops and other assorted things that I went to that would have looked new and sophisticated and advanced by the standards of Washington, D.C., or Denver, or Cleveland, Ohio, or San Diego, California, shocked me. I had no clue just how advanced and new and modern their economy was. In clearly ways that, some of it has come in recent years with investment, people wanting to help Ukraine. A lot of it has not. I mean, a lot of it really is new, in the past 10 years or so. And it was interesting to me how much it looked like America in different parts. I mean, some of the buildings, some of the apartments, very clearly taking cues from American ways of doing things, which I found interesting. It was very clear to me it wasn't like London, it wasn't like Paris, it wasn't like Krakow, Poland, it wasn't like Frankfurt, Germany, it wasn't like a lot of the places in Europe I've been. And I found that very interesting and sort of worth noting when you're thinking about the Ukrainian-American relationship.
Yeah, I'll ask one more question, then I'll turn it over to Thomas. I think you said when I talked to you before, was it Kharkiv was one of the first cities you went to?
Yes, so I spent most of my time in Kyiv, which is the biggest city, but I also visited Kharkiv. And Kharkiv, it's hard to get a sense of geography and what it means to the war unless you go there. I mean, I had paid reasonably close attention to the war as someone who's, not an Eastern European expert, basically since day one of the invasion. I mean, I knew roughly what was going on in the front. I paid attention to the diplomatic goings on. I knew about how different aid packages were going down. I mean, I knew a fair amount. It's very hard, like I said, however, to get the sense of the geography. So the war, as we know it at this point, is mostly going on in the southeast of the country. And that area is where you have, in the farthest southeast of the country is Crimea, which is of course seized by Russia in 2014. But then in all the regions along there, for don't even know how many hundreds of miles, that's where the front is, where we think of as all the fighting. However, sort of the not the southeast, but instead the northeast of the country still borders Russia. And on top of that, some of the areas in the northeast were invaded early on. I mean, I heard these names, but I didn't really get a sense of the geography until I actually visited. And in the northeast, not where the front is, but the southeast, there were areas such as Kharkiv that were actually invaded early on, but the Russians were pushed out very quickly. That doesn't mean they didn't do massive damage. I visited, for example, a neighborhood of Saltivka, which about 500,000 people lived. I mean, it was a big neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, one of the biggest in Europe, and it was mostly older Soviet-era apartment buildings, things of that nature. And I was shown where the Russians invaded from. It was across an open field, right into a lot of apartment buildings, and the damage to these buildings was massive. There was one building, best I could tell, that at least in the initial parts of the neighborhood, that had been reconstructed to the point where people could live in it. Most of them were fallen down or had tons of smoke and bullet and cannon damage to them, tank shell damage to them. They were burned out. They were uninhabitable. Hundreds of buildings, and it was really shocking to see, because there was no way that the Russians couldn't have known they were invading a residential area. I mean, it was blindingly obvious from across an open field. That was interesting. But I want to stress, when I talk about the damage that was done initially, this is the part that really was sort of an eye-opener to me. The level of damage was that it didn't stop after the initial invasion. Kharkiv is only 20 miles from the Russian border, although it is not where the bulk of the fighting has been for the past 2+ years. And it hasn't been a source of major battle. That said, the Russians hit it constantly. There were at least, I was only there for a little over a day, and I was shocked at the amount. I had 2 air raids at least, 2 that I remember, that happened while I was there. And while I was there, I was shown things like the Ukrainian equivalent of a Home Depot, which a few months earlier had been hit by a glide bomb and had killed 16 people. I mean, saying there's not much, military purpose in the Ukrainian equivalent of a Home Depot should be obvious, but it was the case. And it was right next to a mall that would have looked modern by Minneapolis, Minnesota standards. I mean, it was a brand new mall. Went in, got a cup of hot chocolate. It was right next to it, and the mall was full. People didn't let the attack stop them, but it was very, very real that they were still under constant attack. I was shown later on in the day, we went to have dinner at a pizza restaurant, and a block away was a municipal building that was basically caved in from a Russian attack earlier. It's being hit constantly, as a lot of cities that are not on the front, that are not part of the wider battle, but still get hit by drones, by glide bombs, by basically anything the Russians can throw at them. That's Odessa, that's Sumy, that's Kharkiv, among others. And that was a reality I did not understand at the time before I went. And it's also something that I think you need to think about when you're thinking about Russian intentions. The idea that this is about, we want the areas that are, ethnically Russian speaking. That's a whole other debate, right? Because what language you speak at home does not necessarily tell you what place you really consider home. And frankly, the Ukrainian language has gained massively in popularity since the beginning of the war. Shouldn't be a shocker. You're not a big fan of people who are lobbing cannon shells at you. But even if they were to say that, they would at least have a colorable argument of what they're doing and why. I don't think it would be just, but you could at least kind of understand that maybe theoretically on some level you'd kind of see where they're coming from. It has nothing to do with that. It's purely a war of conquest, and it's purely a matter of subjugating a country that they don't think should be able to act independently. And they don't care who they kill, and they want the whole country. They don't have limited aims. They have unlimited aims.
Great. Well, I'll hand it over to Thomas. Go ahead.
Sorry, can you hear? Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Go
I got my mic. I got to remember which color is on for this mic. So, okay.
It happens.
I guess specific to like your knowledge here, I would like to hear, I suppose you got to talk to quite a few people there in Ukraine. What would you say? There's just so much propaganda in the United States, and the right-wing media sphere is just, inundated with it. It's just, you just talk to people who are like normal Republicans where they were normal Republicans 10 years ago, at least. And, they get so much from these podcasts, and it's so much Russian propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a couple questions about like the perception of the war from the standpoint of Ukrainians.
Sure.
What's the perception of Zelensky from the standpoint of a Ukrainian, and also in relation to the sort of post-Soviet corruption that they had to climb out? They've had to climb out of. What would you say about that?
I would say Zelensky is their president during a time of war. I mean, really, no more, no less. I think that there are people that have different opinions of different things he's done or his approach to different things, but the idea that he is, illegitimate or that he is wildly unpopular is just factually inaccurate. And beyond that, it's interesting to, if you look into this for even a second, if you actually know what you're talking about, even if you were to hold elections tomorrow, which again is against the Ukrainian constitution, which doesn't allow it during times of war, and it would be really interesting to hear these people that talk about elections all the time explain how they're going to get votes from the other side of the front lines, or even the front lines, or even any places that are under attack. I mean, there's so many problems. But even if you were to say you absolutely need them, the only person that seriously threatens Zelensky from a popularity point of view is Zaluzhny, the first, commander of the armed forces, which is the ambassador to the UK right now. He's the only person that I have heard any Ukrainian say, might pose an actual threat to him as a presidential figure. So, pretending that this is some kind of, big, gotcha moment. Oh, look, it's not democratic because it hasn't held an election during a war. I mean, it's ludicrous. And it's also ludicrous if you know anything about history. Churchill didn't have an election during a war. America is different. I mean, it's true. America has had elections during the Civil War and during World War II and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, it's true. But it's not, but, frankly, other than the Civil War, which admittedly is a very strange case, we've never quite had it on our doorstep the same way the Europeans have. It's just different, and you need to understand that. But again, I think that's how they view him. In terms of corruption, I was at a speech that a Republican that I think is basically a good guy, Congressman Mike Lawler from New York, he said something. He was talking to some Republicans that were, and he's very pro-Ukraine, and he threw out this, well, Ukraine's corrupt. And Mike Lawler goes, look, I understand about Eastern European corruption. My wife's Moldovan, for God's sake. And then he went on to say, yeah, sure, there's corruption. He's like, but that doesn't change our mission. And also, you have to understand that we do a lot to. I should say two things. One, the Ukrainians have done a lot to crack down on corruption. Zelensky has jailed even close political allies that have engaged in different forms of, frankly, fairly mild corruption. And that has spooked a lot of people. And culturally, it has changed the country. And they understand that the perception of corruption is harmful to their cause. And they're very united in their cause as a people. So I think it's massively on its way down. I think all of even remotely objective observers know that. It's also true that people seem to think that we are sending, big piles of money to Ukraine, in which case they run around spending it and, some rich guy skims off the top. That's just not reality, right? The vast majority, of the aid we give are actually arms. It is missiles, it is bullets, it is, different sorts of equipment, military equipment, and in some cases, it's financial aid, but it's done through the same kinds of practices that we do in every country, some of which are far more corrupt than Ukraine. USAID before Trump did whatever he did to it, and still being fought out in the courts and all this kind of stuff. For example, when I was in Kharkiv, my guide, who was a guy, was a PhD student before he basically dropped out during the war to be active and trying to help his people. He was working for something called Kharkiv Media Hub, which basically made sure that journalists that made it as far out as Kharkiv, most of which don't, they just go to Kiev or Lviv or something like that, to make sure they understood what was going on. He showed me around and explained the situation and showed me different important places as a favor to a friend, but he wasn't getting paid to do it. Before, USAID was partially funding Kharkiv Media Hub, so Western journalists could get a fair picture of what's going on. Now that's not happening. But the point is, and look, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars in the case of that. It was a tiny grant. But my point is that this is not going into the ether. I'm not going to say there's no corruption. Obviously, that'd be ridiculous. But to claim that it is somehow happening on some industrial scale, we're getting fleeced, it's ludicrous, frankly. And anybody that knows any details about what's actually going on knows this.
Yeah, that's more or less what I suspected. And it's also my understanding that Zelensky was kind of voted in as sort of a reform kind of candidate as well, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. But you have to. The one thing that's very important to understand is that Russia's beef with Ukraine, as we think of it anyway, started in 2014 when they chased out the former president. This gets really complicated legally and politically, but basically the former president that was in there up to 2014 was more or less pro-Russian and was more or less corrupt. And due to that corruption, he was trying to take Ukraine out of negotiations with the EU and out of a more pro-Western direction as a result. Ukrainian people were angry with this because it wasn't what they signed up for. They were protesting, and to try to squelch the protests, he basically opened fire on protesters, killing, I believe it was over 100 of them, and that didn't squelch the protest, it quadrupled them, and he basically left the capital and the parliament then basically said he had advocated the office and put in a new president. Now, admittedly, a fraught, difficult situation. Russia has repeatedly refers to that as a coup and a pro-Western, CIA, whatever. Not the fact that a Kremlin stooge who now lives in Russia, was trying to rig the game on their behalf and was corrupt. It was only shortly thereafter that Russia invaded Crimea. So, in other words, it was Ukraine moving away from their corrupt past. It was trying to get, more in a Western direction. It was trying to become a more free, more pro-Western, more prosperous nation that led to Russia getting concerned. So long as Ukraine was weak and corrupt and easily manipulated by Moscow, Moscow didn't care that Ukraine was, at least on paper, independent country. Is when it was started to move in a direction that Moscow didn't like and way they couldn't control that, that things changed. Again, I think you need to think about that when you're talking about, when you're thinking about how to look at this conflict, when you're thinking about how Russia is thinking about it, when you're thinking about how we should deal with it. That is where this comes from. It's not from, any sort of, basically misguided sense that Ukraine is really part of Russia. It's just not true. They didn't care about that until Ukraine started to do things that displeased Moscow.
Yeah, it's interesting that when this disaster at the Oval Office happened with the meeting with Zelensky, I think we all agree that was a disaster. But I'm hopeful that things are improving now that Zelensky was able to get Trump's ear without J.D. Vance jumping in. But in the disaster, I think the way that people perceived it differed based on their understanding of the situation in Ukraine. If you really understood what was going on in Ukraine, you were probably more angered by how J.D. Vance and the president were behaving, because it would just seem very clear that they didn't have a deep understanding of what was happening in Ukraine, and I don't think they had a very good understanding of Russia and why security guarantees were so important to Ukraine if they were going to have any sort of peace negotiation.
I mean, that's the generous interpretation.
Yeah.
I hope that's the right interpretation. I mean,
I'm trying my best here to be generous.
Fair enough. I mean, that's one interpret. The other one is that, there's sort of a different concept of international relations. The post-World War II order, and frankly, to some degree, even the post-World War I order, is the idea that, countries' sovereignty matters, that, self-determination matters, and that we should guard self-determination for small nations as well as large, because at the end of the day, it's better for everyone. That has been sort of the concept for 100 years. Russia, certainly under Putin, does not believe that. I mean, they like sort of the old school spheres of influence where we're the big dogs, we decide if little dogs can do this or that, we talk to the other big dogs, and that's how the world gets sorted out. Now, that has all kinds of disastrous repercussions for human rights, for trade, for defense, I would argue. But that's the way they want things. Let's just say that the Trump administration has some sympathy for this point of view is not a ridiculous charge. I'm not sure it's true, but there's reasons to think they do believe in some version of that. In fairness, going the other direction, since the disastrous meeting and a series of more disastrous things, I think Putin has overplayed his hand massively. He thought that he basically had Trump after that point and that he could get whatever he wanted. I mean, let's put it this way. I was in Kyiv the day that Putin had the phone call with President Trump that's become very famous after the disastrous meeting. And this was hearkened as this big breakthrough, and supposedly they had this serious talk about a ceasefire. I believe it was about 3 hours or less, might even been less, after this talk of a ceasefire, where I was personally going from my dinner in Kyiv back to my hotel, where the air raid siren started, and drones started attacking Kyiv, and there were explosions in the sky based on air defense shooting them down. I mean, hours after this supposed proposed ceasefire hitting the Ukraine's capital. I could go on and on about the numerous times, frankly, far worse than ones I experienced in places like Odessa, like Sumy, like Kharkiv, and other places that have been pelted repeatedly, right around or right after Putin has put out some kind of, PR stunt involving Trump claiming to be for a ceasefire, and then he does something like that. I think at some point, Trump sort of got the idea that maybe, I'm being made to look foolish here. And I think that that's sort of what swayed him. I don't know what Zelensky said to him at the Pope's funeral, but whatever he did, it seemed to work. My hat is off to the guy. Frankly, it would be very difficult for me, after all the indignities he faced, to sort of sit down and have a good faith conversation that actually changed things. The guy is a real statesman, but 2 times credit. He has somewhat, at least right now, changed direction from sort of helping Ukraine lose to, at least in small ways, appearing to help it win. I mean, he has approved some more aid. He has approved this F-16, training program, and things like this that he's done in the last couple of weeks. I don't want to give him all the credit in the world, but it's a hell of a lot better than where we were a couple months ago.
Yeah, I very much believe in the stick and carrot thing with our current president, whoever he is. So we should, give him a few carrots so that he keeps going in that direction. That'd be good. So it is concern. So now in the meeting when things started to unravel, it seemed to me that Zelensky was just calmly correcting J.D. Vance on sort of the history of this conflict, and then that started the overreaction and them screaming at him. One of the things that people didn't realize in America, because we're just not as educated as Europeans about this conflict, is that what he mentioned, the 25 ceasefires that Putin had already broken since 2014. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to say about that, the history of that?
I mean, just that you have to understand Russia's psychology when it comes to this kind of stuff. And they do not... I heard a historian say something interesting that perhaps explains it best. This is the best way I can explain it. That Russia feels secure when there are Russian troops on both sides of the border, but you have to, when they have Russian troops on both sides of the border, then they feel secure. The problem with this kind of mindset is that, number one, it obviously destroys sovereignty of any other country. The other thing, however, is that it also has no end point. In other words, so let's say, for example, we have, troops on the Russia side of the border, but we also either directly or functionally have Russian troops inside Ukraine or Russian assets inside Ukraine that make Ukraine, maybe it's not officially part of Russia, but it's kind of part of Russia. Well, now you have a new border. Now you have troops there or assets there or friends there, but you don't in Poland. So now Poland becomes a new border. And then now you're nervous about that border because you don't have Russian troops on both sides of that border. It's endlessly expansive and it has no stopping point. Mm-hmm. That is very much a traditional, it's not even a Soviet thing. I mean, this goes back to the era of the Tsars. It's been a Russian problem for hundreds of years. President Nixon, gave a very famous, a talk that was not famous at the time, in which he sort of described this in 1992, shortly before he died, saying that, communism has lost, but freedom has not yet won in Russia. And if we're not careful, we'll have a new despotism that lasts for, that it goes back to the traditional problems of the old Russian Empire. And he was right. He was 100% right, and that's what we're seeing now. Another academic whose name is escaping me, I heard give a talk recently, said something along the lines of, NATO is not a problem for Putin because he's afraid that NATO is going to attack Russia. NATO is a problem for Russia because he knows it prevents him from attacking first. And that is what is kind of fundamental to his sense of security. And so you have to view all of this stuff in history through the lens of what Russia thinks and how it's acted. I mean, I don't think you really need to be an expert in all the details of this history and how it's worked in their diplomacy and military. I'm certainly not. I know enough to be dangerous, but that's about it. You don't have to be to understand. All you have to do is look at their actions since the fall of the Soviet Union. Certainly since 2008 when they invaded Georgia for no good reason. I mean, it just happened again and again, and it's played out again and again. And my guess would be it will continue until they are corrected, until they are stopped. You know, a friend of mine said that, you know, Germany had to be told twice to change its behavior. Once in World War I, once in World War II. Then it changed. The South had to be told twice to change its behavior. You know, it basically the Civil War and then peacefully, relatively speaking, the Civil Rights Movement. You know, both times it had to be say, look, you can't act this way. Finally, it did change. Russia's been told once that it needs to change its behavior with the utter collapse of the Soviet Union after the Cold War. The best thing for not only the world, but ironically for Russia, would be for it to lose this war and lose it badly, because only then will I think it have a chance to sort of fundamentally change the way it looks at the world and rebuild as a normal country. I mean, Russia has great people and a great history of literature, of food, of just ideas, and until it changes its current DNA, though, those are all going to be under threat, and so is the rest of the world.
So would you say then that Putin, sometimes Putin publicly in the last 20 years or 25 years has said that he wants to restore the old Soviet borders, right?
Things of that
nature. So that's definitely, we're very well aware that that's what he wants. He wants the old Soviet whatever. But there's also this sort of Eurasianist strand. People like Dugin. Do you think that it stops even there? Do you think he wants to go all of Europe? Or
I mean, I think that his worldview. I think Putin could probably pass a lie detector test. Well, A, because he's a really good former KGB operative. But beyond that, because he actually believes, probably on some level, that no, I don't want the whole world. I just want, X, Y, and Z. I want the old Russian Empire back, kind of thing. And he'd probably pass a lie detector test saying that. That said, his manner of behaving has a logic all of its own. And look, Putin's 71 years old. Sometime in the next 20 years, almost certainly he'll be dead, possibly much sooner. And the question is, does the logic that he has imposed on the machinery of Russia, on its politics, on its business, on its military, carry on past? And I think unequivocally it will, unless it's changed. And so that logic, again, has no real endpoint. You can say, oh, sure, I just want the old Soviet Union, borders back. But number one, you got to realize what that would entail. I mean, that would entail all of Eastern Europe. That would entail close American allies and NATO members, even very powerful ones like Poland. It would entail, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and different, even arguably Afghanistan. I mean, this is a massive, massive increase in Russia's borders. And even if you say that that's all you want, number one, that's a huge claim. But number two, okay, so you get all that. You're still left with the fundamental problem. Look, the Soviet Union was not peaceful when it had all that. It kept clamoring for more. It's the logic of their foreign policy, and it's going to continue so long as this mindset is sort of the one that Russians run with.
So, when the sort of populists, right, sort of people like Elon Musk even, or J.D. Vance, or Tucker Carlson, all these people, when they talk about the diplomacy and putting an end to this conflict, and how much is too much, right? And why the people are dying? Why don't we put an end to this? Blaming Ukraine for not surrendering. That how does that look to a Ukrainian? That why don't we just stop fighting? How does that look? What does that look like to them? Like from an existential level, is that even an option for most Ukrainians?
Let's put it this way. I spoke a lot to religious leaders while I was there. I met with a Protestant minister that runs a seminary. I met with an Orthodox priest. I met with the chief rabbi. I met with the mufti of Ukraine. And all of them said something roughly along these lines. And that is basically that they were in touch with their flocks on the other side of the front lines, that they were not safe. They could not openly practice their religion. In some cases, particularly the Orthodox, churches, and they were, or just Christian, I should say, in general, less so the Jews or the Muslims, but Christians on the other side of the front line were being either forced to go to the Russian Orthodox Church, the one under the control of Moscow. One church is controlled by Moscow, or basically suppressed, not allowed to meet at all. Not the case in Ukraine, by the way. I actually went to a Russian a church that reported to the Moscow Patriarch in Kharkiv. It still is open. People still went there, but not on the other side of the lines. And on top of that, you hear stories repeatedly getting out of people, being forced to speak Russian whether or not they want, being forced to take part in, Russian activities and Russian culture in ways that are, Moscow's part of Moscow's goals. So what you're seeing is, basically, the destruction of a culture for sure, and I would argue more. I mean, saying that Russia has not been careful to preserve Ukrainian lives, that it supposedly is liberating, is putting it incredibly mildly. They've had absolutely no, desire not to kill massive amounts of people. So that sounds to Ukrainian like it's not only accepting, certainly accepting the end of our culture and our heritage, our language, our religion, but in many cases also our lives. So, good luck. They're not going to do it. I mean, I will say one thing I took away from the trip of people I talked to was how incredibly united the country was in not capitulating. Let's say, for the sake of argument, which I'm not conceding will happen. Matter of fact, I'm quite certain it will not happen anywhere near the near future, and probably never. But let's say somehow Russia, achieved its goal and rolled tanks all the way to Lviv and captured the whole country. It still would not control the country in a meaningful sense. It still would be facing, I think, guerrilla fighting. It would still be facing, resistance in a million different ways. I mean, for God's sakes, the Poles were able to help overthrow the Soviet Union without a single tank. That would be on steroids in Ukraine. It would never end, in my view. And I think that we need to understand that when we're making policy.
Mm-hmm. Are you optimistic about this, the new sort of momentum that Ukraine has to sort of take control and I guess they need to have enough of a win to put Putin on the defensive where he has to drop out of this thing, right? So what are you optimistic about in the near term in the next couple of years?
Optimistic would be the wrong word. I would say not pessimistic, perhaps hopeful, but not optimistic. Look, here's the way I would put it. I think the Trump administration did tremendous damage in the first few months of its administration to Ukraine. However, Ukraine had done a lot of work starting in 2014 to reform itself. And Europe takes this far more seriously than we do. And the Russian military, I don't want to call it a paper tiger, that's far too strong. However, it is clear that the Russian military is not what it once was. Probably, ironically, because of corruption. I mean, a lot of money has been stolen. They did not train the right way. They were not as strong as they once believed themselves to be. This is not the Russian military of World War II, which even that I would say was somewhat overrated in some ways, but that's a different story. I mean, they were certainly willing to grind Germany into dust, losing massive amounts of their own people, and they did so. But this is not that Russian army. They simply don't have that anymore. I've said to people occasionally, there is an unsung hero, for example, of the Abraham Accords. I know this is a shift in topic, but let me explain. The Abraham Accords, where several Arab nations that had been technically at war with Israel for well past my lifetime, decided they were at peace with Israel. Open trade, open cultural exchanges. Why did they do this? They did this not because they loved Israel or loved Jews or decided they had been totally misguided. They did it because they were afraid of Iran, and they were spooked that the U.S. might decide to not be involved in the Middle East and protect them anymore. And they needed another strong ally to deter Iran. Israel, they saw, had connections, had money, had weapons. We need them. So in that sense, the unsung hero of the Abraham Accords was not Donald Trump, was not Benjamin Netanyahu, was not Mohammed bin Zayed. It was Barack Obama by spooking the Arabs. I do think Trump has had somewhat of a similar effect on Europe. I think he has spooked Europe into thinking the U.S. might not be involved. I think Germany and the U.K. and France and the rest of them now are concerned that might happen, but that has a silver lining. Now, that has very negative effects for American long-term foreign policy, but as far as Ukraine goes, that could have a silver lining. It could mean that Europe is going to be taken a lot seriously. And here's the thing. I don't think the U.S. has the power to impose its will on Ukraine. Certainly not without far, far, far more pressure than I think even the Trump administration is willing to exert, because it would have massive blowback, not only for American foreign policy, but for American economics and so on and so forth. So my guess is, Ukraine is not going to lose anytime soon. The question is really, what terms do this war end on? They are either going to end on sort of neutral terms, which I think is better than an outright loss for Ukraine, but not nearly as good as an outright win. And the reason isn't just for Ukraine, it's for the rest of the world. An absolute loss for Russia, I do think, will, by necessity, force them to change their foreign policy. And while a sort of half win or half loss, depending how you look at it, or just a sort of a neutral stalemate, means we do this again in 5, 10, or 15 years with the same catastrophic results. So in other words, that's why I think this ends. And I think that, I think that's the direction it's going. What level that happens at, to what degree, that remains to be seen.
Do you have any questions, John? This is fantastic, actually. Thank you so much. And do you have any questions, John, before we close up?
Yeah, well, that was very insightful, Cliff. It was very much appreciate you coming on the podcast. I just wanted to close by asking you one more question. So we mainly brought you on to talk about Ukraine, but there was a big occurrence in another part of the world recently, a part of the world that you're familiar with. I think I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this. The Kashmir region of India. Mm-hmm. 26 people were killed there in a terrorist attack, which has potentially huge implications for India and Pakistan, who are longtime nuclear-armed rivals. Mm-hmm. You actually went there to Kashmir just a couple of years ago, where very few Americans have been. Can you talk about that region a little, as well as your thoughts on the attack and where you think things could go from here?
Sure. In some ways, look, it's very different than the Ukraine-Russia dispute, but in some ways there are some similarities insofar as I do think at the end of the day, this is a foreign policy and ideology-driven conflict. So, very brief history. Kashmir is a region that is actually split between India and Pakistan and a small sliver with China. It was a principality during the British Raj, which controlled, all of India, what was then India. Now we think of it as India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. But there were areas that were Muslim majority and areas that were Hindu majority. And it was split up on the theory that Muslims and Hindus were sort of different nations, and it was split up into Muslim and Hindu majority areas, leading to what was then India and Pakistan. Kashmir was a principality run by a Hindu Maharaja, but had a Muslim majority. So it was also on the border between what became India and what became Pakistan. So this became a flashpoint right away. Long story short, after the Hindu Maharaja decided to go with India, he had dithered for many, many years, basically trying to, or many months anyway, trying to sort of get the best deal, probably for himself. But once the Pakistani military invaded, he signed with India. India rushed in military because Pakistan was also rushing in military. They wound up with more or less a 2/5 or 3/5 belonging to India, 2/5 belonging to Pakistan, a little sliver to China. That's sort of what ended up being the case at the end of the conflict. And this was, in the late 40s, after, the end of the British Raj. That has continued ever since. That same conflict. In many ways, it's similar to the Israel-Palestine conflict, when you had the partition of the Middle East and the partition of the British Mandate of Palestine and all that kind of stuff. In some ways, it's very similar. This was repeatedly seen as this has repeatedly been a hot flashpoint between these two countries, and it's very underappreciated what this means for a lot of people. Now, Pakistan was founded on a theory, frankly, that I think is inaccurate. It was that Muslims and Hindus in this region of the world were fundamentally different people and fundamentally different societies, and that they needed to be split. Now, the funny thing was there was massive integration between the two communities, which led to one of the largest mass migrations in the history of the world when these two countries were split, which led to millions and millions of deaths. With people from both sides, some Muslims in what is now India going to Pakistan and vice versa. However, this idea that they're completely separate people with completely separate ways of life, I just don't think holds up. I mean, are there differences, Muslims and Hindus? Of course there are. But that doesn't mean they can't live together. The irony is right now, there are actually more Muslims that live in India than Muslims that live in Pakistan. Now, partially that's because India is so large and so populous, but it's also because, frankly, you got to realize that Pakistan was 10% Hindu when it was founded. It's less than 2% last I checked. And they have had demographic decline of their Hindu majority or Hindu minority in a very large way. India has not. I think that proves that with the appropriate governance, and which is not to say India is perfect or anything close to it, but they haven't persecuted their Muslims the same way, frankly, Pakistan has persecuted its Hindus. But the point is, Pakistan believes its whole identity is based on this idea that Muslims and Hindus are different people, and they must be the champion of South Asian Muslims. And so Kashmir is sort of a black eye on their very identity, which has led to them being wildly focused on Kashmir and trying to control it, because it's a Muslim majority region on their doorstep. Now, this was frozen in time for decades. In 2019, there was a massive terrorist attack that led to the killing of 40 Indian police officers, and then the Indians executed a part of their constitution that basically ended Kashmir's semi-autonomous status. The point of this was eventually they were supposed to negotiate the end of hostilities with Pakistan, but, what was it? 70 years later, it still wasn't the case. So they said, look, this is ours, we're keeping it. It's now, we're ending its special status. We're integrating it fully into India. You can do whatever you want with your side, more or less, but we're keeping ours. And since then, the Indian government has been admittedly heavy-handed in how they've done that. I mean, they shut down the internet. They put huge stops on different kinds of funding going on of different organizations, a lot of which were terrorist groups, frankly. And then we're backed by Pakistan. But for 5 years, the point is, for 5 years, between 2019, that terrorist attack, and a few weeks ago, there were no major terrorist attacks. There were occasionally targeted killings of activists and such that were more pro-India, but there was no large-scale terrorist attacks since 2019. This was Pakistan's attempt to upset the status quo and sort of keep the issue hot, keep it live, because they don't want to let this idea that they must speak for all South Asian Muslims and that they must control all these regions. That's part of their ideology. One of their top general gave a speech just days before the terrorist attack, basically saying exactly this. And so again, I think this is very dangerous. There's no doubt that having two nuclear armed powers facing off is scary. At the end of the day, I don't think either side wants to nuke each other, but I do think that Pakistan was very insistent on wanting to keep this issue alive because they've been losing, frankly. they have been losing on the ground. As India has invested more in Kashmir, as it has gained more, international recognition. There were G20 events held there in recent months. Things like this really tweaked Pakistan because it basically said that you've lost this conflict. They wanted to make sure the world knew they hadn't lost. Frankly, they should lose. Salman Khurshid, a former Congress Party member of Parliament and the Foreign Affairs Minister decades ago, who was a Muslim, said famously, and I'm paraphrasing but just barely, if religion is going to be used to carve up the world, then the whole world needs to ready itself for the chisel. And he's right. You cannot, use solely religion to redefine borders whenever you feel like it. Pakistan wants to. India doesn't. India is not perfect. It is not saintly. I have numbers of criticisms of government, including of how India has handled some of its issues with its Muslim minority. However, at the end of the day, Pakistan is the one in the wrong here, and I think that while we should, not be egging on, some kind of massive conflagration, we should be siding with India. The reason the U.S. has sided with Pakistan or been in the kind of relationship it has been with Pakistan for so long is basically a relic of the Cold War. It really shouldn't continue. The fact that India just killed one of the people that beheaded Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl just now, 20-something years after it happened, explains a lot about how they think of the world. They were protecting some of the worst terrorists in the world, which India, 20-something years later, was kind enough to take out for us. So anyway, I guess that's how you ought to think about all this. It's a very important issue. And I think when you look at India, look, we have differences with India. We are going to continue. They're close with Russia. They have a historic relationship there. They are suspicious of what they view as Western powers' intentions. That's not going to change anytime soon. At the end of the day, however, India is, relatively speaking, prosperous and democratic and pluralistic. It is concerned with a rising China. It is concerned with radical Islam. It has similar goals as the United States in many ways. And any president or any Congress or any policymaker that doesn't take that into consideration is really missing the boat, in my view. And in the decades in the future, it's going to matter a lot.
Well, it also seems you want to pull India towards us and away from Russia and China too, as part of that calculus.
Yes, I definitely think that's true, and I definitely think that it's hard, but it's necessary. And I think that here's one thing to realize, and this was not always true, but it's true now. Pakistan is now functionally a client state of China. It's constantly broke. Its military, along with some radical clerics, really run the show. Ostensibly, it has a parliament and a prime minister, but they can't really go against the wishes of the military and the radical leaders. They are backed by China, and to the degree we are going to be in a sort of a new sort of conflict with China, Pakistan is not going to be our friend. They are far more indebted to China than they are to us. And even to the degree we can kind of keep some cleavage between them and China, that's going to be extremely difficult to maintain over time. And so, I'm not ever against trying to, minimize conflict with any country, at least in the abstract. But certainly in the long run, I believe India is the better bet for U.S. policy and U.S. values.
Well, Cliff, this is all great information. I want to thank you for coming on the first episode of the Reagan Caucus Podcast. You always provide helpful insight, and it would be great to have you back on sometime. Thomas, is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap things up?
No, I just want to say thanks again. I think it went very well. I thought everything. I feel like you did a great job, and we're so thankful to have you on here. And maybe you'll be willing to come on again at some point.
I really enjoyed it. Happy to do so anytime.
All right. Well, thanks for everyone who's watching this today as well. We will see you next time on the Reagan Caucus Podcast.